Beneath the chaos of World War II's fiery battles lies a chilling tale nearly erased from history. In 1944, high above the Pacific's remote Chichijima Island, members of the US Navy's air units embarked on a perilous bombing mission that spiraled into a nightmare of unspeakable horror. What began as a desperate fight for survival turned into a harrowing descent into darkness as captured American aviators faced unimaginable cruelty at the hands of their captors. This is the haunting story of Chichijima, a place forever marked by the sacrifice and suffering of these brave airmen. By the latter years of World War II, the Pacific Ocean had become the primary battleground in the struggle between Allied and Japanese forces. As a part of the Bonin Islands, Chichijima was more than just a speck on the map. It was a strategic lifeline for the Japanese military, a hub of communications and a critical outpost in their Pacific defense network. As the tide of war shifted and the Allies closed in on Japan, this remote island became a battleground, drawing American pilots into one of the most perilous arenas of the conflict. Chichijima's importance lies in its location and its capabilities. Situated roughly 500 miles south of Tokyo, the island was an essential node in Japan's communication web. It housed powerful radio transmitters and served as a key relay point, enabling the Japanese High Command to coordinate operations around the Pacific. For a nation fighting a war on multiple fronts, maintaining communication links was a matter of survival, and Chichijima was central to this effort. In addition to its communication facilities, the island served as a resupply and refueling point for Japanese naval and air forces. Its proximity to vital shipping lanes and its fortified defences made it a linchpin in the broader strategy to protect the Japanese homeland. By 1944, Chichijima had become a fortress, bristling with anti-aircraft guns, bunkers, and well-trained garrisons prepared to repel any attack. As the Allies advanced across the Pacific in their island-hopping campaign, they targeted strategic locations to weaken Japan's ability to wage war. Chichijima, with its communication infrastructure and defensive significance, was an obvious target. American forces recognized that neutralizing the island would disrupt Japanese command and control, creating chaos in their operations. However, Chichijima was no easy mark. Unlike some of the smaller, less fortified islands targeted in earlier campaigns, it was heavily defended and presented a formidable challenge. The US Navy and Air Force launched repeated bombing raids on the island, aiming to destroy its transmitters and weaken its defenses. These missions were fraught with danger. The island's rugged terrain, bristling anti-aircraft batteries, and vigilant defenders made every approach a perilous gamble. For the American pilots tasked with attacking Chichijima, the mission was one of extraordinary risk. Flying long distances over the open ocean in often unforgiving conditions, they faced the constant threat of mechanical failure, navigation errors, and enemy interception. The bombing runs required precision, as the heavily fortified targets were difficult to damage. Pilots had to fly low and close, exposing themselves to intense anti-aircraft fire. Even beyond the immediate dangers of combat, the stakes were unimaginably high. If a plane was shot down near the island, capture by Japanese forces was almost certain. Unlike some of the larger battles where prisoners of war might be transferred or held in relatively structured conditions, those who fell into enemy hands on Chichijima faced an uncertain and horrifying fate. The island's isolation and its role as a critical military outpost meant that captives were treated as expendable, their survival considered inconsequential to the larger war effort. For many of the young American pilots, missions over Chichijima were their first encounters with the grim realities of war. They flew knowing the odds were stacked against them. The radio chatter from fellow airmen and the sight of planes plummeting into the ocean or crashing into the island were constant reminders of the danger. Yet they pressed on, driven by duty and a desire to bring the war closer to an end. the relentless bombing campaigns took their toll on both sides. For the Japanese defenders, the strain of constant attacks and the mounting losses were a harbinger of the war's trajectory. For the Americans, each mission was a gamble with lives hanging in the balance. The waters around Chichijima became littered with the wreckage of downed planes, silent witnesses to the bravery and sacrifices of those who dared to challenge the island's defences. But unfortunately, for many, those missions ended not with triumphant returns, but in plumes of smoke, spiralling aircraft, and the chilling uncertainty of enemy captivity. For the American pilots tasked with disabling Chichijima's critical infrastructure, each mission was a deadly gamble. The strategic importance of the island had transformed it into a fortress, and its defenders were relentless. As bombing campaigns intensified, the skies became a brutal proving ground where bravery clashed with near certain peril. Many young men embarked on these missions knowing the risks. A direct hit by anti-aircraft fire could tear through a plane's fuselage in seconds, leaving no chance for survival. For others, the dangers of mechanical failure or running out of fuel over open water were equally daunting. Yet the thought of capture by the enemy loomed largest of all. On Chichijima, survival outside the cockpit often came at an unthinkable price. The missions were precise and calculated, until they weren't. In the chaos of flak explosions and tracer rounds ripping through the air, even the most skilled pilots could find themselves spiraling toward the ocean or the unforgiving jungle of Chichijima. Those few seconds before impact often meant the difference between life and death. Lieutenant Floyd Hall was one such pilot. His Avenger bomber was struck by ground fire while returning from a run, forcing him to eject over the island. His parachute opened against the backdrop of smouldering treetops. For a fleeting moment, he may have hoped for rescue, but as he descended, enemy soldiers were already converging on his landing site. Captured and disarmed, he became one of several airmen who fell into Japanese hands during these raids. Lieutenant Hall's capture was not unique. Other pilots, like Ensign Warren Vaughan, were forced down into Chichijima's perilous terrain. The fates of these men, young, brave, and full of hope, were no longer in their own hands. What awaited captured pilots on Chichijima was far from the conventions of war. The Geneva Conventions, meant to ensure the humane treatment of prisoners, held little weight on the remote island. For the Japanese garrison, reeling from the increasing pressure of Allied advances, every resource, even human captives, was viewed as expendable. The airmen were subjected to brutal interrogations, often beaten and deprived of basic needs. Their captors sought any fragment of intelligence that could aid Japan's crumbling war effort. But the fate of these prisoners extended beyond mere questioning. Stripped of their uniforms and identities, they were reduced to symbols of the enemy, a sentiment that carried catastrophic implications. As days turned to weeks, the plight of the captured airmen took on an unimaginable turn. Witness testimonies and post-war investigations unearthed horrors that few could have anticipated. The island's isolation, combined with the growing desperation of its defenders, created conditions where ordinary wartime atrocities gave way to unspeakable acts. For many of the young pilots, death would not come as a soldier's honour, but as a descent into something far darker. Their voices were silenced, and the details of their final hours would surface only through the accounts of those responsible. The skies above Chichijima, once filled with the thunder of engines and the echo of gunfire, held a chilling silence after the missions ended. Below, in the shadows of the island's dense jungle and fortified outposts, the final chapter for these captured airmen played out in secrecy. What they really endured remains one of the Pacific War's most haunting mysteries. All we know is that the captured American pilots on Chichijima faced a fate that defied comprehension, one that transcended the horrors typically associated with war. For these young men, the moment they were taken prisoner marked the beginning of an ordeal so dark that it would be remembered as one of World War II's most disturbing and controversial episodes. The Japanese garrison on Chichijima, under the command of senior officers tasked with holding the island at all costs, viewed the captured American airmen not as prisoners of war, but as tools, or even as burdens. With supplies dwindling and morale eroding under the pressure of relentless Allied assaults, the soldiers' treatment of prisoners devolved into barbarity. As we already mentioned, interrogations were brutal and devoid of mercy. Pilots were beaten relentlessly, starved, and denied basic medical attention. The goal was to extract intelligence that might slow the Allied advance, but the reality was far more punitive. The captives became symbols of Japan's growing desperation, scapegoats for the frustration and fear that gripped the defenders. For these airmen, the torment was only the beginning. The execution was a foregone conclusion, driven not by necessity, but by the perverse reasoning of Chichijima's leadership. The isolated nature of the island, combined with the increasingly dire circumstances of war, led to decisions that violated even the most basic principles of humanity. It is here that the story of Chichijima descends into its most horrifying chapter. Following the execution of several captured pilots, acts were committed that stand as a grim reminder of the extremes to which war can push individuals. Japanese officers on the island engaged in acts of cannibalism, selecting body parts from their victims and consuming them in rituals meant to fortify their own strength or morale. This practice, documented in both survivor accounts and post-war testimony, was not born of necessity. The island's garrison still had access to food supplies, though limited. Instead, these acts were carried out under orders as a twisted assertion of dominance and a means of reinforcing loyalty among the soldiers. The details, though difficult to confront, are supported by substantial evidence. Testimonies from Japanese soldiers and officers later revealed that the practice was orchestrated by Chichijima's leadership. Their motivations varied. For some, it was a psychological weapon intended to instill fear and control among their ranks. For others, it was framed as a desperate assertion of strength in the face of impending defeat. Yet, against all odds, and in the face of what seemed like certain doom, one man managed to defy the grip of death and escape. Meet George H.W. Bush, the lone survivor of a doomed mission over the Pacific near Chichijima. At just 20 years old, George's life teetered on the brink as his aircraft plummeted into hostile waters. His narrow escape from capture not only shaped his personal destiny, but also preserved a vital thread of history, ensuring that the haunting events surrounding Chichijima would never be forgotten. In 1944, George H.W. Bush was one of the youngest naval aviators in US history, fresh-faced but determined to serve his country. As the war in the Pacific raged on, George found himself stationed aboard the aircraft carrier USS San Jacinto, flying a TBM Avenger torpedo bomber. The missions were perilous, but the stakes were clear. Every successful sortie brought the Allies one step closer to Japan's defeat. By this point in the war, Chichijima had become a prime target for American forces. Its communication stations and defensive installations posed a significant threat, and eliminating them was a top priority. On September 2, 1944, George and his crew, radioman second class John Delaney and gunner Lieutenant Junior Grade William White, were assigned a mission to bomb a Japanese radio facility on the island, a mission that would change George's life forever. As George's Avenger approached the target, the sky erupted with anti-aircraft fire. Flak shells exploded all around the plane, rattling its frame and sending shards of metal into the air. The aircraft sustained heavy damage and smoke began pouring from its engine. Despite the imminent danger, George maintained his focus, successfully releasing his payload on the target. The bomb struck its mark, igniting a fire at the radio facility. Moments later, the situation spiraled out of control. Flames engulfed the engine, and George knew the plane was doomed. He ordered his crew to bail out as he struggled to maintain altitude. Tragically, neither Delaney nor White made it out alive. Their fates remain uncertain, but it was believed that they were either killed by enemy fire or perished when the plane went down. George managed to eject from the aircraft, parachuting into the choppy waters below. The impact was brutal, and he found himself alone in the vast Pacific, struggling to stay afloat. The young aviator clung to a life raft, waves crashing around him as he drifted closer to enemy territory. For hours he floated, exposed to the elements and the constant threat of Japanese patrols. But George's survival was nothing short of miraculous. As he drifted closer to Chichijima, Japanese forces on the island spotted him and dispatched boats to capture him. Knowing what had happened to other captured pilots, George paddled desperately to evade them. Each stroke of the paddle carried the weight of his life as he pushed himself to exhaustion in the hopes of staying out of enemy hands. Then salvation arrived. An American submarine, the USS Finback, surfaced in the nick of time, spotting George and pulling him aboard. Weak and shaken, George recounted the harrowing experience to his rescuers. The weight of what he had narrowly avoided, the brutal fate that awaited prisoners on Chichijima, was something he would carry with him for the rest of his life. George H.W. Bush was the only survivor of his crew. The memories of Delaney and White, the men who served alongside him, were never far from his thoughts. For George, their loss was a poignant reminder of the randomness of survival in war, how the flip of fate's coin could mean life for one and death for another. More chilling, however, was the knowledge of what awaited those captured near Chichijima. In the years following the war, Bush learned the full extent of the atrocities committed on the island, including the horrific treatment of downed airmen. The thought of what might have happened had he been captured weighed heavily on him. Surviving such a close brush with death gave George a profound appreciation for the fragility of life and the importance of service. His wartime experiences instilled in him a humility and empathy that would later become hallmarks of his leadership style. As George transitioned into politics, he often reflected on his time in the Navy. While he rarely spoke in detail about his near-death experience, those who knew him noted how deeply it influenced his outlook. The memory of those he lost and the countless others who never returned home served as a constant reminder of the sacrifices made during the war. George's survival also played a critical role in ensuring how the story of Chichijima was not lost to history. His prominence as a public figure brought attention to the events surrounding the island, prompting greater scrutiny of the atrocities committed there. In later years, as historians pieced together the full story of the Chichijima atrocities, George's account became a vital part of the narrative. George H.W. Bush's life after the war was marked by decades of service to his country. From his role as a congressman to his tenure as the 41st President of the United States. Yet no matter how far he rose, the spectre of Chichijima remained part of his story. It was a reminder of how close he had come to sharing the fate of his fellow airmen, and how that brush with death had shaped the man he became. Now you're probably wondering what happened to the Japanese officers and soldiers responsible for the atrocities on Chichijima after the war ended. Well, the answer lies in the grim proceedings of the Tokyo war crimes trials, where the horrifying events on this remote island were brought to light. These acts, unthinkable in their brutality, might have faded into obscurity, overshadowed by the devastation of Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the Holocaust. Yet, thanks to meticulous investigations and the courage of witnesses, the truth emerged, revealing a chilling reminder of the depths of wartime depravity and the critical importance of holding those responsible to account. In the wake of Japan's surrender in 1945, Allied forces initiated a sweeping effort to uncover and prosecute war crimes committed by Japanese military personnel. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, often referred to as the Tokyo Trials, were established to address crimes against humanity, violation of the laws of war, and crimes of aggression. While the trials primarily focused on high-ranking officials like Hideki Tojo, the atrocities on Chichijima became a critical point of examination. The trial uncovered shocking evidence of crimes committed against American airmen who had been captured near Chichijima. Allied investigators, armed with testimony from Japanese soldiers and surviving records, revealed the harrowing details of what had occurred on the island. The evidence was undeniable. 8 captured American pilots, including Lloyd Wellhoff, Grady York, James Jimmy Dye, Glenn Frazier Jr., Marvel Marv Mershon, Floyd Hall, Warren Earl Vaughan, and Warren Hindenlang, had been executed by Japanese officers, and their bodies had been subjected to acts of cannibalism, acts not born out of starvation, but out of ritual and twisted military indoctrination. The leader of the Chichijima garrison, Yoshio Tachibana, emerged as the central figure in these atrocities. The investigation revealed that he had ordered the executions of the captured pilots, justifying the killings as necessary for maintaining discipline and morale amongst his men. More disturbingly, Yoshio Tachibana and several other officers were directly implicated in the cannibalistic practices that followed the executions. The trial proceedings were grim and methodical, aimed at piecing together the truth and holding those responsible to account. Witnesses included Japanese soldiers who had served on Chichijima and in some cases participated in the crimes. Their testimonies provided chilling insights into the mindset of the island's leadership. One soldier described how Yoshio Tachibana had ordered the executions with calculated precision, presenting the captured pilots as symbols of Japan's enemies who needed to be eliminated. Another recounted the horrifying moment when Yoshio Tachibana and other officers decided to consume parts of the victims' bodies, claiming it would imbue them with strength. These testimonies, combined with physical evidence and corroborating documents, painted a picture of systematic brutality that left little room for doubt. The defense for Yoshio Tachibana and his subordinates centered on claims of wartime necessity and obedience to orders. However, the prosecution dismantled these arguments, demonstrating that the crimes went far beyond the bounds of any legitimate military rationale. The acts committed on Chichijima were not the result of desperation or survival. They were deliberate, calculated atrocities that violated every principle of humanity. In 1946, the tribunal rendered its verdict. Yoshio Tachibana and several of his officers were found guilty of war crimes, including the unlawful execution of prisoners of war and acts of cannibalism. Yoshio Tachibana was sentenced to death by hanging, a punishment that underscored the severity of his actions. Several other officers received lengthy prison sentences, reflecting their complicity in the atrocities. While the sentences brought a measure of justice, they also raised broader questions about the nature of accountability in war. Some argued the lower-ranking soldiers, many of whom testified against their superiors, were as much victims of Japan's militaristic indoctrination as the American pilots they had helped execute. This complexity highlighted the moral grey areas of war crimes trials where the line between the perpetrator and victim is often blurred. Despite the severity of the crimes, the story of Chichijima was quickly eclipsed by larger narratives of the war. The use of atomic bombs, the Holocaust, and the overall devastation of World War II dominated public attention, leaving the atrocities on this remote Pacific island as a footnote in history. Even within Japan, the events on Chichijima received limited acknowledgement. Post-war Japan's focus was on rebuilding and moving forward, and many of the darker aspects of its wartime past were deliberately suppressed or ignored. For decades, the crimes committed on Chichijima were rarely discussed, overshadowed by debates over the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the complex legacy of Japan's role in the war. What would you say to someone who denies or minimizes the events on Chichijima? How can we, as individuals, ensure that the truths of war, no matter how uncomfortable, are preserved and shared with future generations? Share your thoughts below, and let's work together to keep the voices of history alive and honor the memory of those who endured its darkest moments.